can't think of anything worse than losing a child. A previous guest on the show, award-winning actor Jason Watkins, talked on this podcast about losing his 2.5-year-old daughter Maudie to sepsis. The pain must be unbearable. Child Bereavement UK is a quite brilliant charity that supports children, young people, parents and families when either a child grieves or a child dies. For the last 3 years, my daughters and I have had the privilege of singing at their annual carol concert in December, and the outpouring of thanks from parents and families about how child bereavement has supported them and continues to support them in the worst of all circumstances is truly humbling, moving, and inspiring. If you know of someone in these circumstances who needs their help, or if you'd like to support the work that they do, either by donating or giving your time, please contact them via their website, www.childbereavementuk.org. Every penny and every effort will make a difference. Thank you. Hello and welcome to Bandwidth Conversations, a podcast that finds out about the stories and journeys of artists, performers and rock stars of life. Lord Byron said, "Always laugh when you can. It is cheap medicine." Charlie Chaplin said, "A day without laughter is a day wasted." There are so many quotes on this, but also a lot of research that tells us how laughter reduces cortisol levels, strengthens the immune system, heart health, social connections, mental health, resilience, and coping skills. It is also a natural pain reliever. As I was researching my guest today, I began to realize that all the television shows of my youth that made me laugh were actually thanks to him. Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, Not the 9 O'Clock News, Blackadder, Spitting Image, QI are just a few of the TV shows that he has made happen in some shape or form. He's an award-winning writer, producer, director, and presenter. When I mentioned him to a friend of mine in the business, he described him as the god of comedy producers. I am delighted to get the chance to talk today to John Lloyd. Thank you so much, John, for being here.
It's a pleasure, Casey.
Your father, the youngest naval captain during the Second World War, was asked to sink the German battleship, the Scharnhorst. And I was just so interested in that because my grandfather was on the Duke of York and they actually did end up sinking the Scharnhorst.
Well done, Grandpa.
And then unfortunately, I never met Grandpa, but later he was on HMS Edinburgh and they were torpedoed. What happened in regard to your father?
So my dad was from an Anglo-Irish background and his dad was the last of a whole string of kids and had nothing, no money, and was a hobo in the Yukon and all sorts of things like that. And his older brother was the guy who owned the big house, the stately, he was a general in the First World War. I'm named after him, John Hardress Lloyd, he was called.
Okay.
And he said he liked my dad as a little boy. And he said, "My boy, you can have any career you want as long as it's the Royal Navy." So he was packed off to Dartmouth at 13 and had the most amazing time in the 30s, when the Royal Navy commanded the world, really, going around the world. So it was a giant cocktail party with guns, really. So he was in most torpedo boats in the war as a very young officer. He wasn't a captain then. He'd have been a lieutenant commander, I should think, probably. Yeah, and anyway, one day he was coming back from a raid on the French coast in these 3 fast patrol boats, most torpedo boats. And the C&C got on the phone and said, "Lloyd, you've got to turn round and sink the Scharnhorst and the Gneisenau, because they've escaped from Brest and they're going up the channel. If they get to the Kiel Canal, get to Hamburg, it's a disaster for everyone." At my dad's memorial service, the vicar told this story. So they're dog-tired, this crew, having been up all night, and my father gives the order to turn round and go back out to sea. And as he's doing so, there's 2 boys outside Dover where they were based. And the coxswain, who was so tired, he got the wrong boy. And he said, "Oh gosh, so that's a big cloud bank up ahead." And my dad looked up and it was the White Cliffs of Dover.
Oh my gosh.
And they ran these 3 boats up the beach at 60 knots, tearing off the propellers. And my father got out of the boat in his white polo neck, his, naval jacket and his sea boots, having destroyed this flotilla of MTBs, and thought, not only have I ruined my life, I've lost the war for Britain.
That's a lot to have on your shoulders, age 22.
Yeah. Anyway, so he called the commander-in-chief, who was amazingly good about it, said, "Harpy, everyone's entitled to one mistake, just don't make another one." And he said to me, my dad, he told me this story in front of a bunch of old naval admirals at a dinner, and he said, the thing is, John, at the time it was a disaster, but if we had gone round the right buoy and gone back to try and sink the Scharnhorst, every man on those boats would be dead, and you would never have been alive. So it's a big moment for him. It wouldn't have stood a chance for 3 most torpedo boats against the flotilla of German battleships. Not a chance. It was the last ditch. He happened to be the nearest guy to where they were going.
Okay.
So they were just throwing everything at it. Would have been a suicide mission, essentially. He was at Dunkirk. He had to rescue all those soldiers on the beach, and he couldn't take all of them. My sister thinks he had nightmares all his life about not being able to save everybody's life.
I'm sure. That meant that you were the son of a naval officer,
Yeah.
and you were then travelling a lot in your young life. And then at the age of 9.5, you go to a prep school, West Hill Park in Hampshire. Tim Sullivan, who is a screenwriter and author, and he was on the show recently, and he described his time at a prep school under a sadistic headmaster. What was prep school like for you?
Well, I did a thing last year called the Hoffman process, where you're meant to address all of your ancient past to see if you can find how you acquired bad habits like perfectionism and procrastination and so on. It's really interesting.
Yeah.
So I had to do a lot of thinking about this. And it was an awful shock getting dropped off and with your mum and dad in the station wagon, as they were then called. You're coming, no, darling, we'll see you in 10 years. Goodbye. Sort of.
Yeah.
So the first couple of weeks were pretty awful. There was a lot of crying in the dormitories and all that, but I wasn't 6 like so many people of my age were. But to be perfectly honest, in the early 60s, little boys quite liked scrapping. So there was a lot of rugby and you fighting with your best friend and then making it up. And it's humiliating getting beaten. I didn't enjoy that at all, particularly as I think every single time I've been beaten at school was for something I hadn't done. And that's given me this fierce sense of trying to right injustices. I really date it to that. I really hate people who use their authority unfairly. But that aside, it's fun. There was a lot of larking about, breaking bounds. We used to smuggle potatoes into school in our socks, the balls of socks, and then cook them in the woods. We were starving most of the time and spotty and cold, but it was good fun. I think really didn't like public school so much, which is then right in the middle of the 60s. Everybody else is at the Summer of Love and you're dressed like Neville Chamberlain. You've got a cane and a boater. It wasn't so amusing. And
that was when you were at King's...
Yeah, King's Canterbury. Yeah.
King's Canterbury.
And one thing I remember with kind of strange affection was me and 3 friends dressed in our wing collars and pinstripe trousers and canes and boaters went to the cinema because we were just turned 18 and we went to see an X film called If, which is about a British public school, Tunbridge as it happens, in this case, which is quite near, and starring Malcolm McDowell in his first big role, directed by Linda. It's an absolutely brilliant film about how these rebellious teenagers, like we rather were, basically machine gun the headmaster and kill all the parents at school.
Oh, God, it's an absolute winner for school children.
We were going, yes! Anyway, when the lights came up at the end of the film, we stood up and the whole audience, we looked exactly like the prefects, the bad guys in the film, and the whole audience shouted, "It's them, get them!" and chased us out of the cinema. We were lucky to get away alive, really.
Yeah.
So, yeah, and it was very, for me, If was more like a documentary than a drama, really. It was so well done, written by 2 boys who'd been at Tunbridge, and so it was very personal. Yeah, but the thing for me is like, if you spent nearly the first 10 years of life going around the world, and I spoke Spanish when I was 3, and I'm Maltese when I was 9, and the thing of the regimentation was the thing that my mum used to sort of teach us by. She's very bright, but her dad was a sort of Victorian paterfamilias, and he didn't think women should go to university, particularly because his wife had been at university very, very young and had had a breakdown because of it. So my mum's very smart, and she used to teach us on troop ships and in the car on long journeys, basically in quizzes. So what I learned until I was 10 was all fun. And I really date the whole experience of QI to going right back then, because the rest of it, from 10 till 19 is basically sitting rows repeating back what you've been told by somebody.
Yes.
And I don't think that's the way anybody should be educated ever.
One of your projects is creating a school based on QI principles, which keeps the fun in the whole learning process.
I'm sure it would work. I know a few teachers who use our QI books to open the lessons with, because I think that every school lesson should begin with something that's really interesting, that people go, what? How? What? And if possible, funny. And the teachers who use the QI method are the most popular teachers in their school because everyone really looks forward to their lessons. There's a lot of stuff talked about kids that they have a low attention span. They do not. I'm watching your kids watching telly downstairs, quiet as mice. You watch anybody who's into gaming or anything that they're absorbed by. Really, if kids are looking out the window, you've got to ask yourself, whose fault is that?
Yes.
And what happens to teachers who use QI ideas is if the children are engaged and laughing and really interested, the rest of the lesson's very easy because they're yours. You can then tell them anything you want, including sit down and listen to this and try and remember it.
Yes.
Because it's the fun bit. Don't need much fun to keep them engaged and cheerful. And certainly those teachers don't spend most of the lesson trying to keep order, which is what teachers often do now.
Yeah, you're right.
There's a thing that's got around that somehow young children are stupid. They are not stupid, and they're just as intelligent as we are. They're just shorter and no less information. So
Yes.
The sooner you get to treat even quite small children as if they're an equal, the better it is for everybody. We should teach the value of disobedience in school and standing up for what you believe in and not necessarily shut up, sit down, do what I tell you. Because I have a theory about the Germans and the 2 world wars. Is the principle is the Germans are not bad people. They are an incredibly cultured nation with an extraordinary track record. But what they certainly are is rather obedient people. They're very good citizens. And Hitler was a legally elected chancellor. And they said, well, what can you do? This is the government. They didn't riot against it. A lot of bad things happen, but not because people are disobedient, because they're too obedient. Whereas England is a nation of football hooligans, basically, won't be told anything, which makes them quite good at having a punch-up. It's probably why we haven't had a revolution for so long, is because people are always needling away at the government. And in my life, for example, I think it's astonishing that there isn't any satire on television. I think that politicians, as a matter of course, should be made fun of publicly, often. I think it's very good for them. They actually quite enjoy it. And it's a great way of getting across information that in a newspaper would be either nasty or pompous.
Yes.
You start lecturing people on who the bad guys are.
Yes.
They just get angry or they take to the streets. If you make jokes about them, well, it's good for everybody.
You got to Trinity College, Cambridge, to read law. How would you describe those university years?
Well, it was absolutely glorious. I couldn't understand how I'd got to Cambridge because I'd really stopped working at 15 because I was a scholar when I was little. So by the time I was 13, 14, I had 11 O-levels, something like that. We were really crammed.
Wow.
The scholars were all pushed really hard.
And is there a point of doing that so young?
I don't know. It's all you know, isn't it? I mean, it was very hard work. But then the point was the scholars tended to be undernourished, weedy boys. We were all much smaller than the huge swinging dick rugby players. People say that they didn't know what to do with us. So you couldn't really put us into the 6th form and head to university because we were so small and young. So we had this fantastic year called the Special 6th, where age 15, we were treated like grown-ups. And we did essays, we had a poetry club, we did debates. It was absolutely marvellous and really, really interesting. But then they still didn't know, so we had to go back into the lower 6th with the huge spotty boys with enormous willies and who, frankly, were struggling with quite simple ideas. And it was really dull. And the 6th form for me was really just waiting to leave, really. And so I couldn't believe I passed the Cambridge entrance exam. And I thought, well, I'm bound to be the stupidest person in the university. And quite honestly, I had 200 friends in 2 weeks. And I just thought, well, these people are just like me. you've been to Oxford. That
Yeah.
people think, don't they, that if you haven't been to Oxbridge, it's full of knobs. They're all geniuses, and they're not. They're just usually just quite people who work quite hard at school, who've got a good memory, and they're just like you and me. I mean,
Yes.
I found my tribe, and I felt really comfortable. And the only thing was that I'd made this stupid decision to tell the history master, who insisted I go to Balliol to read history in Oxford, that I wanted to go to Cambridge. And he said, "Why?" I said, "Well, I want to go to Trinity, sir." He said, "Well, there's only one historian at Trinity. He's a funny little Indian chap called Mr. Seal. Why would you want to?" I said, "I want to read law, sir." He went purple, this man. He would have beaten me if he could have thought of an excuse.
Wow.
Because it didn't look good on his sheet. Another scholarship or exhibition on the history department. So I went, and honestly, within 2 weeks, Katie, I thought I've made the most stupid mistake. That's the thing, is sometimes the teachers are right. I didn't get on with law. I always wanted to be a crusading defense attorney. That was my plan. But it was so obvious that they weren't really interested in people who wanted to right wrongs. They're interested in people who could remember the case law. So I clocked off from that. And that really, like so many things in my working life, is it when you read introductions like that, or when I look at my Wikipedia page, if I'm stupid enough to do that, it looks like it was planned in some way, but it's not. It's all mistakes. It's usually as a direct result of a card-carrying disaster, quite often my fault, that what looks like going terribly wrong has turned out okay. So I really tried to go to lectures for a term or so, and then I thought, I can't do this. So I had to do my essay once a week, which I did diligently, but I didn't do any work really. But I decided to have a go at everything else because I didn't know what I wanted to do. So I had to go at straight acting. And I was quite good at that. I was good at that at school. And then I did a bit of student politics. I was elected to the college council as a student rep. And so I spent a year listening to dons buying and selling vast amounts of land in East Anglia and arguing about paying the train fare of visiting lecture and so on. That was pretty interesting at 20. I ran the Trinity College picture lending scheme. In my first year, there was a very nice guy who ran the Trinity Review, which the year before had Prince Charles in it. I just missed Prince Charles at Trinity.
Oh, right. Okay.
He was the previous term, and he'd become quite famous by doing a sketch when he sat in a dustbin and did funny goon voices. So I'd seen that in the newspapers. I'd never heard of Footlights when I went to Cambridge, didn't even know they existed. But I certainly knew about Prince Charles and the Trinity Review, so I got a part in that. And then the director, when he left end of that year, he said, "Do you want to take this on?" So the next year I wrote and directed and was in the Trinity Review with my great friend Richard Burridge. And we asked, as we didn't really have a closing number, so there was a fantastic actress at the time called Mary Allen, who was the Footlights, the doyen of Footlights, the glamorous person, swept round Cambridge in a big cloak. And she was a very glamorous figure, and I asked her if she would sing a closing number, and she said yes, and I fell in love with her completely head over heels and spent my last year basically writing jokes and hanging out with Mary. It was marvellous. So I discovered my vocation in my last year completely by accident, really. I was in Footlights because Mary helped me get in there and just squeaked into that. And then the big opportunity for Footlights is going to the Edinburgh Festival when all the media come and see you. And the director took me to the pub and said, "I'm afraid you can't come, John, because we haven't got the money to have all 8 of you up there. And everybody in the Footlights Review also has to be in a straight play to amortise costs." The Cambridge University Dramatic Society took a Chekhov or an Ibsen. He said, "I can't risk you in an Ibsen or a Chekhov because you will obviously get laughs and ruin it." And so I started to tear up a bit because it's happened several times in my life. My career's over before it's begun. But he said, "Look, okay, I tell you what, BBC Radio want to do a pilot. You could do that if you want." And I was a bit miffed at the time, but I went home and thought about that. But radio's great. That's what I grew up to. My naval dad, the one thing that kept us all together laughing was listening to the radio at Sunday lunchtime and in the evenings, listening to all the comedies. So it was very much my sense of humour. So I started doing that, and I watched, it looked like the next year's Footlights, they're all going to become extremely famous. They had a West End premiere, and I thought, oh no, I've missed the boat. I'm just stuck in boring old radio. But it crashed. It closed within a few days. And then we got commissioned to do a second show and then a series. So I was actually a writer-performer on Radio 4 at 22.
What was it called?
It's called Oh No, It Isn't.
That's a good name.
Well, the idea was that if we got a bad review, we could say, oh no, it isn't. I don't know. I can't remember the reason. But anyway, so again, getting fired from Footlights, which my very amusing line is, I claim to be the only person who's ever been fired from Footlights for being too funny.
Yes.
You see?
Yes.
I can make anything funny, but no, it's a silly thing. But it was, again, an accident that turned out all for the best. And actually, extremely few of us stayed with it as actors or performers. Griff, Rhys Jones, is the only one, really.
Having made your mark in radio, you then moved to television. And how did that happen?
This is like in the psychiatrist's chair, isn't it? It's brilliant. Very good.
I'm sorry. I'm looking at you thinking this doesn't look like a very comfortable chair either.
No, it's fine. It's fine. They're very good questions. I discovered my vocation at the age of 22. I found this is something I'd never wanted to produce anything or direct anything. I didn't want the job. I was so poor I had to do something. And I found it was just something that came naturally to me. In my first year, I produced 100 programs for Radio 4 and Radio 2.
100?
100, 2 a week.
Wow.
I did 500 programs in 5 years. I really was hooked on it and a fanatical workaholic. But then in 1978, 3 things happened. A pilot program that I had devised with one of my best friends, Pete Spence. He was a brilliant writer, and I produced him. And we decided to devise the perfect sitcom together. And so we sat and thought about what a sitcom's about. They're about people who are trapped in a thing they can't escape from. There's usually a point of conflict. It might be money, it might be class, it might be whatever. And we came up with this thing called To the Manor Born. And we were really pleased with it. And Pete said, we should send this to Penelope Keith. I said, are you crazy? Penelope Keith's one of the most famous actresses in the country, if not the world. But we sent it to her, and she said, I'd love to do it. We were hopping up and down with delight. Anyway, so I called my booker at the BBC, the person who did all the contracts, and I said, I'm so excited. I've just got Penelope Keith to do a pilot for a radio sitcom. And she said, who? I said, Penelope Keith? She said, I've just looked her up on the file. She hasn't done radio for about 15 years. I said, no, because she's on the West End. She's in the Parker Pen advert. She's in The Good Life on television. She hasn't got time to do radio. So they offered her a fee of £60, which she didn't say until after she'd done it. Said, John, I can't work for £60 a week. Even Roy Hudd, who I was producing at the time, was getting 120 for a show. So she took it to television, and Pete Spence went with her. And he said, oh, come on, leave your job. And I wasn't brave enough to do that. But I lost that baby. And then another show I devised was a thing called Quote Unquote with Nigel Rees that ran for, crikey, 40-something years. That went off to Yorkshire Television as a television thing under a new title. And then Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy that you mentioned, Douglas Adams was my best friend. He got stuck 4 episodes in. He asked me as his best friend if I would help him out. I did. And then when it suddenly got famous, he gave me the boot. So I felt I was being shot at. So 3 programs that I've either devised or saved have all dispensed with me. So I lost my temper and stormed out. And I remember hearing the same guy who'd said to me, would you like to be a producer, David Hatch, who sadly isn't with us anymore, shouting at me up the corridor, don't be a young fool. In 7 years, you could be deputy head of this department.
Oh, dear.
And I was so angry, Katie. I was so furious with the world that this seemed so terribly unfair. And I went looking for jobs, and I was astonished to find out that I was employable. I just thought, I'm just languishing in a radio backwater. And I went to see Esther Ranson, who I had produced in a late-night Radio 2 show called Late Night Extra. She was a host on a regular basis, and we'd got on very well. And I got offered the job of being one of her cohorts on That's Life, which at the time was the #1 show in the UK, sort of consumer show with jokes. I got offered the part of the young man behind a go, and we phoned the gas board.
Yes, exactly.
And they said that this has nothing to do with us. That person. And then I went to see the head of light entertainment at the BBC, and he said, what kept you? I said, what? He said, we've been waiting for you to knock on our door. We thought if you haven't got the courage to come and ask, we're not going to chase you down. We hope you don't mind. We've earmarked 6 programs for you. So what was it? Production manager, floor manager? He said, no, it was producer. I couldn't believe it. He said, there's only one condition. The head of current affairs on the phone earlier, they've got this lunatic called Sean Hardy something who they don't know what to do with because he keeps putting jokes into Panorama. Will you go and see him? Because we think you get on. So they literally gave me a £5, which is how long ago it was. And I took Sean out to lunch. He was current affairs director of Panorama and things like that. And we got on so well that the lunch that started at 12:30 ended at about 7:30 at night. It was a curry house. I love those
kind of lunches.
It was at that curry house called the Gaylord, and it was in Mortimer Street, just off the BBC. The place, apparently, where they invented chicken tikka masala, oddly enough.
Really?
Yeah.
They didn't invent that in India?
No, it's definitely not India.
Okay.
No, it's either Glasgow or the Gaylord in Mortimer Street.
Okay.
So we set off to do this thing together, and having had this unheard of thing, I've literally never heard of that happen before. Nobody does a thing without a pilot, so I don't know what they were thinking of. And I thought, well, it's only telly, it's just radio with pictures, and how can it be? And so really wasn't paying attention. And we made the first one of the series, but in the editing time before it went out, it became clear that we didn't have literally any other material. And then week 2 was going to be a disaster, and we were going to lose our jobs. And there was, in the wind, was that there was a rumour that Jim Callaghan, the Prime Minister, was going to call an election because he was in trouble in the sort of mess of the 70s. And it was, I think, probably the second last time I literally knelt like a little boy at my bedside and thought, please God, let there be a general election and get me off the hook. And there was. And they looked at the pilot, or what became the pilot, and they thought, this can't go out during a general election. It breaks all the rules of the Representation of the People Act. It's too one-sided. So they cancelled it, and we reset for the following autumn, which again saved my life, basically. So I had time to rethink, recast, and really build up the material. But again, skin of the teeth time, really.
What was the name of the show?
It was called Not the 9 o'clock News.
That was Not the 9 o'clock News. I have rewatched some of the Not the 9 o'clock News ahead of talking to you today, and it's still just as fresh.
It's jolly good, isn't it?
It's
That's the thing.
Really good. And even that song, I'm a Trucker and I Like to Truck, I have that in my mind.
2 things I want to say. Firstly, how odd is it that we did not know what we were doing? Sean had never worked in comedy. I'd never worked in television. We didn't have any staff. Every person in the office, the production secretary had been a receptionist. She'd never been a secretary before. The production coordinator had been a secretary. Everyone was a trainee, essentially. We was given an office and told to get on with it. I don't know what they thought they were doing. I think they just must have thought it's... But the thing about being completely ignorant, you don't know what you're not supposed to do. So we obviously made mistakes. We did a lot of things that normal television producers would never have gone anywhere near, because they will say, that won't work. And it did. So we had this really improbable success from nowhere, because we had had time to reset it.
You were writing the sketches as well, you and Sean?
It's funny having these long conversations, because you suddenly see the jigsaw of your life fitting into place, because you'd ask these very pertinent questions. So I think I come from a service family. There's a lot of Army and Navy officers, and so public service is something that's in my bloodstream. And so I'm very proud to work for the BBC, and I considered it, and I still do, it's an honour. It's an institution I believe in principle at least. And I thought my job is to produce this. I'm paid to do these. These writers are starving. I know, because I was a freelance writer.
Yes.
You know, you're living on literally £2 a week. And they really, I'm not going to be greedy about their work. If they sent in quite a good idea, I'll rewrite it for them. Sometimes in rehearsal, but sometimes at night, put a better punchline on. I consider that part of my job. I did a lot of writing, and I've done this all my life, but as an editor,
right.
Creative script editor. And I consider that's part of my contract of employment, to make other writers' work as good as I can help them get it. So, yeah, there's a lot of me in there, but not necessarily credited as such.
Right. Okay. And then how did you find the team of 4, Rowan Atkinson, Pamela Stevenson? You were at university with Griffiths Jones and Mel Smith.
Yeah, Griff always says, they say, how did you get the job in Not the 9 o'clock News? And he always says, the producer was sleeping with my sister at the time, which was true, admittedly. Helen was one of the big loves of my life. What became the pilot was actually the first of a series that never happened. Again, anyone listening to this, I would urge you to always go with your own heart rather than what you think you're supposed to do. And I thought, I'm in television. I'm supposed to be a grown-up. I'm only 27, but obviously I need proper actors. I can't just have mates in this. So we cast some really quite famous people. And of course, there was no chemistry. They didn't know each other. Rowan was in it because he obviously had to be. That was one of the things. Rowan Atkinson has to be in it. Everything else, you can do what you like. So he was jolly good in that. But otherwise, it was a radio show with pictures. So everyone sat on chairs and talked straight to the camera. Nobody moved about. I'd seen Mel Smith in the Oxford Review when I was fired from Footlights, and I went up to see it anyway. And I thought he was unbelievably funny. I went to see him in Chiswick, where he was from, in the pub. And I said, I've made this telly show. Would you be in it? Because we've got another series. And he said, John, this is the unfunniest half an hour of television I've literally ever seen. I like you. I'll have a go. What I didn't know was that Mel, again, accidents. Mel was at that time, all he wanted to ever be was in theatre, and he was an assistant director at the Royal Court, and he was absolutely hating it. He directed at Oxford. He had no power. He really hated it. And he was literally going to go see his dad, who was a Chiswick bookie, and say, Dad, theatre's the wrong thing for me, mate. I'll come and be a bookie because I love horses and love racing. And he was going to do that. And in that week, I came along and said, Mel, do you want to be in the telly show? And he said yes, and it saved his entire direction of his life.
Wow.
And then Rowan, obviously, the first time I saw Rowan, I thought, this is the funniest man I've ever seen, again, playing in Edinburgh. And it's not that I discovered anybody. Everyone knew he was going to be famous. He was a must. Then we had a guy called Chris Langham in the first series who I'd known and worked with, but turned out to be, as he would be the first to admit, tricky. And we really struggled. We knew we had to have, for heaven's sake, we've got to have at least one woman, even in the 70s. We knew that.
Yes.
And I asked everyone you can think of that I thought might, Victoria Wood, Alison Steadman. There was a whole string of them that I was a fan of, and they all said no. They didn't want to be in this, clearly, this idiot who doesn't know anything about how to make television with a bunch of spotty people from Cambridge and Oxford. There was a very nice senior producer at BBC Radio called Peter Tithridge, who was gay, and he and I got on very well. I think he slightly had his eye on me in a very unthreatening way, and he said, I'm having a party on Sunday. Do you want to come? And I thought, I remember waking up rather hungover and don't think I really want to go to a gay radio producer's lunch party. But I thought, no, he's a really good bloke. I'm going to go. And I went, and it was absolutely rammed with people. It wasn't in the slightest bit a gay party. It was just a really good party. And there was an actor there called Nicholas Ball, who was quite famous at the time. And he had on his arm this unbelievably beautiful girl. Blonde hair, blue eyes. I'd never seen anything like it. That was Pamela Stephenson. And
Wow.
I spent the whole party worming my way round to get to meet her. And then I said, would you be interested in being in television? And she looked at me like
you could actually genuinely
I
use
could
that
say it.
line.
But she looked at me, I had crawled out of a drain or something. She said, I already am in television. I'm in a huge ITV drama. I said, okay, fine. Anyway, ITV went on strike a few months later, and I rang her up and said, do you want to do the show now? And she said yes.
And that was it.
Again, so complete accident. She'd never
And she
done
was
comedy
brilliant.
before.
She was brilliant in it. They all were.
Yeah, and there was a lot of legacies of Not the 9 O'Clock News. Obviously, some very funny things, but that acting style that Mel does, that realistic, it sounds like a real person talking. That's all Mel. And what Pamela's contribution was, she turned a whole generation of young women onto the idea that women can be and are funny. They can be funny and clever and beautiful all at once.
Yes.
What she did, her contribution is really stellar. I'm quite sure lots of 13-year-old girls thought I could do that one day.
Yes, absolutely.
The things that seem so obvious. First of all, you know the way London dinner parties, people say, oh, you can't say anything anymore because of this woke nonsense. You know the way they say that?
Yes.
Not 9 O'Clock News was devised by the BBC to be an antidote, would you believe, to political correctness. Did you know there was political correctness in 1979?
No.
No, they said, oh, these people going on about saving the whale. The people who want to save the whale. what's wrong with whaling? That's what they would say. So the cursor moves on. What now seems ridiculous to us, what, a woman being funny? Are you mad? That's what they would have thought.
Yes.
This is never going to work. She's obviously not a funny person. I remember the first time we cast Pamela, not as the nurse. In Monty Python, she'd have been the nurse or the totty, the crumpet. And if they wanted a funny woman, Terry Jones would dress up as one.
Yes, you're right.
In Not the Nine, the first time we cast Pamela, not as the nurse, but as the doctor, I thought, we've crossed a bridge here. We've done something really radical. I thought, this is ridiculous, John. My own GP's a woman and always has been a woman. What is so odd about...
But it was.
So then casting her as barristers and so on and being definitely an equal of all the men in it, it was a big thing. What we discovered was, so at the beginning, I think particularly Mel and Rowan, who got on straight away, they were slightly snickering behind the set going, this is obviously John Lloyd. He's obviously cast her because he fancies her. And they were having a bit of a go. And so we didn't really know what she could do. We knew she could sing. So we knew she was going to be in the songs. But I thought, well, we'll start her off with something safe. We'll get her to do the newsliners. Just read out the news thing of autocue. And she started doing this. And I'm in the gallery going, it's just, what's that weird voice she's put on? What a weird... No newsreader talks like that. That's really strange. I thought, wait a minute. That's Angela Rippon, who was the big newsreader at the time. It was an absolutely pin-perfect impersonation of Angela Rippon, because Pamela is from New Zealand and Australia. And so she thought, I'll have to do a British newsreader, so I'll copy one.
Yeah.
And then we found she could do all of them. She was an absolutely amazing mimic.
Well, it won a BAFTA in 1981. And then let's move on to, we're only going to be able to talk about a handful of them, which is a real shame. But Blackadder, I think, followed, didn't it?
Blackadder, we started that in 1983, so the year after.
Okay. Actually, of all of them, that was my favourite sitcom growing up. And that was the one where my parents and I would look forward to it days in advance. And then we would laugh out loud. And then we would remember lines and make ourselves laugh out loud all over again. And someone was telling me that the first series wasn't as popular as subsequent ones, but we loved that first series. And the Spanish Infanta was a particular favourite of ours. But how did that come about? Because again, that's a really quirky idea.
Well, when you do a very intense experience like Not the 9 O'Clock News, it was 4 years of really living in each other's pockets, incredible pressure, very, very long hours, being right at the edge of disaster all the time, in the papers quite a lot for making a mistake or doing something outrageous. We've had enough of each other, really. And Richard and Rowan decided they wanted to go off and write. I think Rowan slightly modelled himself on John Cleese. He'd done his Monty Python, now he wanted to do his Fawlty Towers. So they went off and they wrote this thing. And I remember it was originally called Prince Edmund and His Two Friends. And I thought, I don't think that's my kind of sitcom somehow. Because there's a sentimental side, as we know, from Richard particularly. And so I said I didn't want to do it. And they made the pilot with somebody else, John Howe Davis, who went on to produce Mr. Bean. And then they kept on begging me. And by that time, it had been a while since we worked together. And I thought, I think it's got to be good. And I think probably was called Blackadder by then. And I thought, yeah, I'll have a go at this. But another life lesson is a lot of young comedians think that they're too smart for the audience. And I really counsel anybody who's going into comedy not to think that. Comedy is a joiner-upper. And you don't look down on the people. Don't think you're too clever for their sense of humour. You're not. You need to basically explain yourself better. The reason it's slightly odd, that first series, is that we didn't want to have to please, as it were, the coach parties in a studio audience. We wanted to be more realistic and dark. So we deliberately designed the sets to be too big to fit an audience in as well.
Okay.
So we shot the whole thing without an audience, a lot of it on film. And again, stupid, we didn't know what we were doing. We bit off far more than we could chew. And in fact, on the first day of filming, for some reason, the director opted to do the very last scene of the first series first. And Rome was in this rather silly costume on his horse, which he'd learned to ride specially. And it was in Northumberland, and it was freezing cold, several degrees below zero. And Rowan's nose was dribbling, I remember. And he leaned down from his enormous horse in this silly hat. And he said, John, what voice should I use? I thought, oh no, we forgot to rehearse. We forgot to rehearse because we're on film, oh no. Anyway, so we shot this whole thing. It took forever. We didn't know what we were doing. And then when we presented it to the BBC, the same guy, John Davis, my boss, he said, it's very odd, this, John. I don't even know whether it's funny or not. It is funny, John. It's just very odd. He said, well, I don't trust myself. I said, we've got to play this to an audience to see whether they laugh or not. So we played the finished cut thing to a
the whole
audience.
Series.
The whole lot, yeah. Which is why if you listen to the soundtrack, it's really odd because it sounds like canned laughter because you keep having to dip the sound.
So you can hear the next
So you can hear the next line. But people often say, oh, yeah, it wasn't as good. But actually...
Oh, I thought it was brilliant.
It did win an Emmy. We won an Emmy. So it wasn't so much of a slouch.
Well, no, and it was because of that all the others followed as well.
The principal thing was that, again, we made it so silly. Again, you're unpeeling my life and making me see it all clearly. I made exactly the same mistake that we made in Not the 9 O'Clock News. We cast famous people because we thought we were now grown up and we needed famous actors in it. And of course, they thought we were mad because we were writing the lines as we went along and changing them all the time. And normally for a sitcom, you've got a small part, you turn up, you're done by 11 o'clock and you go for lunch. And we were keeping them until 7 o'clock at night. They hated it. So that was one thing. And the other, not using your friends. And the other thing was that people like Rowan, Tim McInerney, they're stage comics. They're used to hearing an audience stuff. They time it to what the reaction is. Rowan had no experience of filming without an audience, and so the timing's all off. And when we came to the second series and Ben Elton came aboard and he said, well, for a start, nobody likes the Middle Ages, full of mud and flies and sweat and things. Everyone's horrible. Let's do Elizabethan thing because it's cool and sexy and we can have daring do and so on. And they cancelled off the first series because we went so far over budget. It was known in the BBC bar as the series that looked like $1 million and actually cost £1 million. It was really. And Michael Grade came in and sacked us. And then I called John Davis, my boss, and said, why has he done it? He said, well, it's not that he hates it or anything, John, but it's too expensive for what it is. If you could deliver it what they call strand average cost, what a 2-sofa sitcom costs, if you can do that, we might get another chance. So Richard and Ben and I spent a whole weekend desperately cutting out every bit of film, every graphic, every extra. There were no horses, no dogs, no servants, which is why you get that thing in Blackadder 2 where Miranda is sitting alone in a tiny room with her nanny. She doesn't appear to have any guards or, or even any pictures on the wall. Yeah. So again, it's all a complete accident. Yes. You're doing the best you can with the material you have.
She was brilliant. Miranda Richardson was
she
wonderful.
Believe it or not, she was the 42nd actress I saw for that part. I thought I was losing my mind. It was like trying to cast a woman in Not 9 O'Clock News. I was at my wit's end. Anyway, we're in this audition room, and in walks this woman who clearly hasn't had enough sleep. Her hair's a terrible mess. She's got no makeup on, and 2 lines, and you think, that's the one. That's her. She's amazing. And she is, of course, as you know, a genius, Miranda. Absolute genius.
Yeah, yeah, she
and
is.
Lovely with it.
It made my teenage years, that series. When all this stuff is happening and you're scrabbling around trying to make ends meet, are you having fun while that's happening?
I've certainly had a lot of fun throughout. One of my strange bits of philosophy is that life is perfectly balanced. If you look up at the sky, the planets keep going round and round the sun regardless for centuries. The universe is remarkably stable. That's why when random things happen, like an accident or somebody getting diagnosed out of the blue, it's actually so surprising because most of it is so stable. And I think every kind of life is an equivalent of a sine wave. It's a wave pattern. And you can either find yourself with a flat hills, as it were, so you don't have much terribly exciting happens, but you don't have any disasters. And mine is a roller coaster. It's up and down, up and down. So you'll be having the most fantastic fun, almost unable to speak. You're laughing so much one day. And then the next day, there's a terrible row about somebody's cut the wrong line or somebody's taken offense at something. There's some terrible accident. So all these things are very intense because you've got 2, obviously now both of them world famous writers in a room full of other people who are also writers. Tony Robinson and Stephen Fry, Hugh Laurie, they're all really good writers. And they weren't going to sit and do an indifferent line. They wanted the best line in the episode. So literally every syllable was argued about. And because if you were lucky enough to be in one of those nexuses where a lot of very smart people are learning off each other, the other thing that used to happen is that we made the series every 2 years. And in the gap between, everybody had gotten more famous, more successful, better off, and more used to getting their own way the whole time.
Yes.
So at the beginning, it was like, well, we're so lucky to be working on television. By the third series, everyone said, you can't speak to me like that.
Do you know who I am?
Yes, exactly. There's a lot of do you know who I am.
Yes, I do, because I put you there.
So really the first at least week of every series is trying to remind people, I know you can't order us about, but the fun of working with people that you genuinely love, who are as smart as you, together we can do something which is really, really unusual.
Spitting Image. Another triumph. World's first topical puppet show. And I spoke at the weekend to my friend Giles Pilbrow, who produced the 5th series of Spitting Image. And he said producing the 5th series was one thing. He said setting the thing up would have been something entirely different. And anyway, expressions he threw out, insane logistics, 3D caricatures, so complicated, so stressful. Can you take us through it?
Yeah, it was really difficult, particularly that when I heard about it, I tried to get puppets in Not the 9 O'Clock News all those years before.
You?
Yeah, and I went to see Roger Law, and I said, I'm a television producer. I wasn't, but somebody thought I was. And I said, we've got all these great voices from radio. They can all do the impersonation. They look like the people. So I had this idea, why don't we get a puppet to do it? He said, well, I've never made a puppet. And no interest in puppets. What do you want a puppet for? Oh, he said, all right. He was teaching at Holborn College of Art, I think. And he said, all right, then how much money have you got? I said, about £200 a puppet. And he just laughed. He howled with laughter. He said, piss off. Get out of my studio. And then when I heard he was doing it, a brilliant guy called Martin Lambin-Nairn, who was famous as the designer of the Channel 4 logo, among many other things, had heard about it. And he put up 10 grand to get them started. And I was round there like a rat up a pipe saying, I'm probably the only producer in the country who could, perhaps in the world, who can do this, because I'd done Not the 9 O'Clock News. And I know about doing topical comedy very fast. And they said, oh, we've already got 2 other producers. I said, who? So a guy called Tony Hendra from the Harvard Lampoon and a guy called John Blair who's a documentary maker. Hendra had no experience of television and John had no experience of comedy. I said, well, I'll do it for nothing. I'll work for you for nothing, as long as I get a share in the company if it goes anywhere. So then all the other people who were being paid said, well, we'd like a share as well, if you don't mind. So I worked for a year for them, and we tried to sell this thing all over the country. Nobody wanted it. They all said, John, puppets are for children. Don't you understand? Adults don't watch puppet shows, and it's not going to work. And to every ITV company, I think bar 2. And then the bloke at Central Television said, I'll take 26. So suddenly we were up and going. And again, a bit like Not the 9 O'Clock News and Blackadder, a very bad rep at the beginning. Saying this was awful, it's ugly, and it's no good. It was really the second series where it really started taking off again. But as Giles is absolutely right, it was an insane proposition, the amount of work. There was one series, I think the second series probably, I worked 90 days in a row with 2 days off in the middle on less than 4 hours sleep a night.
My goodness.
Because we go to the bar after so much tension and drink. It wasn't a lot of drugs, it was lager mainly. Fall into bed. And I had to get up at 5. Often you sit in the bath literally crying with exhaustion, think I've got to read the blooming papers today. We were getting 15 million people every Sunday night, 2 minutes past 10. So it's a big responsibility and you're all over the papers most weeks. So it had to be done.
Well, it was an absolute triumph for those of us who were watching it. What about QI? That's a panel show, glittering list of panelists. You've got Stephen Fry, Sandy Tolskvig, David Mitchell, Alan Davis. And for those who hadn't come across it, it's a bit like Have I Got News for You, but it covers anything of interest. And how much of that quick repartee is prepared?
We're the most spontaneous panel show on television by a country mile. There's no prep. If they want them, the panelists can get a list, not the general ignorance questions where a klaxon goes off if you give the obvious but wrong answer, but general questions. They're given a list of them and it just frightens the life out of them because they don't know. Got a question like, why don't pigeons like going to the movies? I don't know what to do with that.
No.
And Alan never looks at them. He finds it's much better to be spontaneous. So obviously the host has got a huge amount of research that now she, Sandy, or Stephen as was, has boned up on, and loads of cards with notes on them to make sure they don't get the dates wrong or the country that they're talking about. I'm not going to dump anyone else in it, but you would be astonished when you hear how much panel shows are scripted or prepped in some way. People given the answers in advance, given funny one-liners that are apparently spontaneous. That we don't do that. It's very, very spontaneous, which is the way we like it. I mean, the idea is you give people some really strange information and see what they do with it. And if you've got people as good as David Mitchell, Bill Bailey, Sally Phillips, Aisling B., Ramesh Ranganathan, Nish Kumar, these people who just love, they're very curious people. You give them an interesting bit of information and they'll go off with it. I've just found one this morning. This is not particularly astounding, but guess which is the best country in the world to do a startup in?
Israel? Taiwan?
All good guesses. No, it's Estonia, of all bizarre places.
Really?
Yeah.
And why is that?
Because they're what they call an E-nation. After they got out from under the Russians, they thought, we got to do what are we going to do? We can do anything we want. And they basically, everything is or 99% of all banking is done online. And when you come to pay your tax reform, rather than spending hours and hours sweating over it and having an accountant paying them, it's all done automatically for you. It takes 3 minutes.
Wow.
You just press a button, pay tax, and it's all done. Isn't that marvelous?
That is marvelous.
And another thing, because of all these startups, the really coolest startup at the moment, they've found a way to suck carbon dioxide out of the air, all the carbon emissions we're so worried about, get the carbon out of the carbon dioxide and turn the carbon into batteries that they can then sell.
Wow. That is extraordinary. Talk about win-win.
But this is what I do, Katie, every day. This is the joy of my job, is trying to find out interesting things that I don't know. QI can be extremely funny, but it's not principally what it's there for. The idea is, again, warming to the theme that's come up before, is I have never talked down to my audience. I believe my audience is just as intelligent as me. In my gap year, before going up to Cambridge, I was an Essex builder. I started as a T-boy and worked my way up, learned to plaster and do tiling and drive the van and all that stuff. So I spent a year with some of the smartest people I've ever met. They're all brickies, chippies, ordinary Essex lads, firemen. They were all volunteer firemen as well. Honestly, one of the best years of my life. And as a middle-class person who never really met any working-class people except for my mum's cleaner, you think, okay, this idea when you go to public school that them out there, the townies, are all a bit stupid, is not true.
No, I mentioned, have I got news for you? That was initially going to be John Lloyd's news round, and you were going to present it.
I was,
and in fact, you did. You presented the pilot with Paul Merton and Ian Hislop.
Yes.
Why did you decide against it?
You really should be doing Desert Island Discs. I think you'd be very, very good at it because you are somehow managing to elicit insight quite unique in my experience in doing these. I do quite a lot of podcasts, and suddenly a lot of things are becoming clear to me that weren't clear before. And one of them is part of the story. You know, we all got a story we tell ourselves about how we got here. They're usually not really true to an objective observer. And mine is that I've been serially fired by a lot of people, often by good friends, by Rowan Atkinson, by Douglas Adams, by numerous people, rather unfairly. And that's helped propel me, because I'm quite lazy, into the next stage of my life. But it's actually equally true.
But that's also quite traumatic when it happens.
Yeah, it is traumatic, often very painful. But it's also true that I have shot myself in the foot so often I shouldn't really have any feet. I went to Cambridge to read law when everybody said, history at the outside English, don't go and do law. It's not for you. You're not that sort of person. And getting on a plate, this what was obviously going to be a huge success topical news quiz, which I really knew because I'd invented the news quiz on the radio. and getting the thing. And at the end of the 80s, I was briefly a television presenter. It's an easy job. Being a presenter compared to producing is a doddle. If you can do it, if you like talking to people, you turn up at 11:30, somebody brings you a coffee, you have a nice lunch, and there's a little bit of light auto cue work, and then everyone says you're marvellous. And you get paid tons of money. But anyway, I don't know why. I just discovered directing ads, and basically I thought I was terrible in it. I was embarrassed, actually. Made me wear a suit that I would never have worn in those days and a pair of red shoes that I would have burned if I'd owned them myself. I felt very uncomfortable. I didn't think I got on very well with Paul and Ian before. I didn't think I did any good, really. I felt uncomfortable, and I felt it wasn't me, and so I walked out. It was nearly a disaster for them. I think Sandy Toksvig did a pilot with them and somebody else, because, believe it or not, I was the person the BBC wanted.
Which was hence John Lloyd's Newsround.
It was just after Blackadder, and I was really quite famous for a producer, and I presented the holiday programme, and what else I'd done, a few things. So I was getting a bit of reputation as a presenter, and they thought, well, he's the perfect guy. He really knows what he's doing, and they trusted me. Angus was much better at it than I was. The first few years of Have I Got News For You were jolly good, weren't they? They were really, really good.
They were good.
I don't think I was ready for that kind of level of fame. I quite like a bit of privacy.
Well, and there is a lot to be said for that. Well, you are presenting the radio series Museum of Curiosity.
No, they've just cancelled it.
Have they? Because you created it, didn't
Well,
you?
yeah, there were three of us, yeah.
Gosh. Well, to me, that seemed to be the radio version of...
QI, yes.
Yes.
We call it the sister show of QI. So the whole idea of QI is that everything, without exception, is interesting if you look at it closely enough or for long enough or from the right angle. How do you deliver that interesting information? Now, QI does it one way, which is essentially the format of QI. Not that we thought of this deliberately, but that's what it is. It's a benevolent teacher with a lot of rowdy kids in the classroom who are a bit stupid and can't pay attention, and they're trying to get these bits across. So the central person is the voice of authority and good sense and has all the answers, and all the people around are idiots, fun idiots. Museum of Curiosity is completely reversed that. The person in the middle is the professor of ignorance, doesn't know anything about anything, and has people who really know what they're talking about. Archaeologists, astrophysicists, dancers, animators, can be anything. And it's an absolute delight. And the people I've met in the 17 series we've been doing have been just amazing. Everyone from Buzz Aldrin to people who are flying doctors and paleobotanists, and made some incredibly good friends. And it's a shame. Anyway, Radio 4 have cancelled it. It is irritating, and I think it's not a good idea. It's cheap as chips because it's all done virtually now, and we put a lot more effort than we're paid. We're not doing it for the money. I'm doing it again because I'm a public servant to my boots, and I believe that it's a classic Radio 4 show. It's intelligent, it's witty, it's informative, it's Breathian, absolutely, to its core.
Yeah.
And the BBC's in many ways, lost its way as to what it thinks it's there for, and I haven't forgotten.
Books. It looks like you have written or co-written over 30 books. The Book of the Dead, Lives of the Justly Famous and the Undeservedly Obscure. Stephen Fry said it's dead good, haha. It's like a mini encyclopedia or biographies of extraordinary individuals, from Florence Nightingale, Genghis Khan, Isaac Newton, to Tuesday Lobsang Rampa, who I read about the other day, who's actually Cyril Henry Hoskin from Devon, so he's probably a relative of mine. Such an ambitious project to, first of all, figure out who you're going to write about and then write about them. What was the motivation behind that book?
We liked the title. I think it's probably the best of the QI books we've done. A friend of mine who's a lifelong editor, who's edited some really, really, really famous writers and is a very creative writer herself, just wrote me this fantastic letter saying how much she loved the book, and she's going over and over again. Again, like so many good things, it was hell on wheels to write, Katie. I mean, it was
well,
really...
Well, it must have been, because
the
scope is so
horrible.
huge.
It's reducing and reducing and reducing, but it's something I use as a tool myself. I was on do you know Matthew Paris's great show, Great Lives, on Radio 4?
No,
well, they take a well-known person and somebody advocates for them, why they think Napoleon or Bach is the greatest ever and so on. And then they have somebody who's an expert in that person. And you have a three-cornered conversation. It's really, really interesting. And I did that. And one of the people in there is a guy called Buckminster Fuller, the guy who invented the geodesic dome, American architect. And they'd run out of famous people. They'd been doing it so long. So they said, is there anyone that you'd like to do that we might not have heard of? And I said, well, this Buckminster Fuller I think is good. So I went to do that. And as my research, I read the 5-page article on Buckminster Fuller in the QI Book of the Dead. I went on Radio 4 and I was able to talk for an hour and a quarter without drawing breath about this guy's life. Because that's the thing, but once you distill everything just to the interesting stuff, it becomes very interesting to talk about. And the expert they'd hired on Buckminster Fuller said, can we go out to lunch? Because you told me things about Buckminster Fuller I'd never heard before.
And he was the expert.
Good. But here's the thing. We thought it was such a good, like the Tibetan Book of the Dead, that kind of thing. It's got a resonance to it. But Sarah, my wife, who's a publisher, said, I think the reason why it didn't sell at all is because most books are bought in December as Christmas present, by far, 90% of them, something like that. And she said, I thought I might give the QI Book of the Dead to Auntie Mousy, but no, she's 90, I can't. It's not a good gift book for your auntie, is it?
No, you're right.
It looks like either
just
a
because
threat
of the title.
That's
so
the thing. It's like,
interesting.
over a long working life is when you're young, you just want things to be successful. And you think that's the important thing. And actually, over a long life, no. The thing to do it is to do it well. And that book's a really good book, I think. And the fact that it was hell on wheels to do and we made absolutely no money out of it doesn't matter. What matters is somebody will find it and somebody will care.
I used to teach and I taught maths, but in those lessons where half the people weren't there or whatever, and you could go off script, then something like a book like that, if you were to sit and talk to the students and say, what about this person here? That would be gold lesson-wise for children or anyone of any age. It's not going away. You've created something that's not going anywhere.
No, one of the programs I want to do is called QI Boot Camp, where you go to schools and you say, give me the most difficult 15-year-olds in the school, the ones you're basically going to get an ASBO and have to go to somewhere special. Give them to me for a summer. I'll take them off to some big country house somewhere with a swimming pool and a football pitch, and we'll start their education all over again.
The other thing that you've done, another massive chunk, is advertising. You spent 12 years as a full-time director of TV commercials. I'm not quite sure where you've had time to do all of this, but anyway.
I don't know either.
Can you tell us a standout story?
I'm also incredibly old. It's like somebody just done an article through. I didn't know that magazine still exists. It's called The People's Friend. And he put John Lloyd, 73, lives in Oxfordshire with his wife, Sarah. And you think, who's that old git? My God. When it's written in print, it just seems so improbable. So it is. I've been in broadcasting for 50 years, so it's not surprising on a few things, is it, really?
Yes, I'm not quite sure. 30 books, 12 years in advertising. That's still a lot. Could you tell us a standout story about your time in advertising?
The peak thing, it was the apex of my life as a successful person, the beginning of my new life, which was in 93. So 92 was a big year for me. I'd done a lot of really good stuff. I don't claim to be very good at many things, Katie, but I was really good at directing short-form commercials. I don't know, it's the pedantic perfectionist nature. I've made a few ads that I would consider perfect pieces of work. I can't see a flaw in them. I've never made a half hour of television I would consider perfect, not even close. So 93, BAFTA decided to cash in on the awards boom. Awards ceremonies, if you've got a good traction, can make you a lot of money. If you think about it. So you let it be known that BAFTA, wow, this is like the Oscars of British television, is having a special advertising awards. And so every agency in the world wants a BAFTA. So if you want to enter your ad for it, you pay, let's say, 100 quid per entry. If you want a table, it's £1,000 a seat for whatever. So that you're making...
Yeah, making a huge amount of money.
Probably millions.
Yes.
So it's a great thing. BAFTA probably didn't have very much money. They booked the Royal Albert Hall. It was an absolute sellout. And on that night, and they had special black BAFTAs made, so they were cool and not like the boring gold ones for actors and things. They're proper black, sexy, Bartleboga, Haggerty. I won 6 BAFTAs on the same night.
Wow.
By the time I won my third one, there was definitely unrest in the room. by the fifth one, the whole Albert Hall is openly booing. It's a fix. They're yelling, fix, fix.
That's not fair.
I was so happy. And I've got these 6 black BAFTAs. I gave them away. There were some clients there. There were some guys from the agency. I gave them all away. Didn't keep one. That year, I had a massive midlife crisis. Literally, that was the turning point of my whole life. And then suddenly I thought, upshot of it is, I've actually won more BAFTAs myself than anyone in the world except Dame Judi Dench.
Wow.
She's got one more than me, 11.
She's
got 11, and good for her. But they're not proper BAFTAs, you know what I mean?
And she's older.
Yeah.
There's still time.
So that was certainly an event. The fun in advertising, all the silly things that happened. I remember doing a very funny ad with Harry Enfield for dime bars. What are they? Soft on the outside, crunchy on the inside. And it was about this yokel saying, they're like armadillos. They're different to an armadillo. Armadillos, crunchy on the outside, soft on the inside. Dime bar. It was very funny. We wanted an armadillo in the thing, and we couldn't find a real one. But we got a stuffed one from a prop house. And we were laughing so much shooting this thing that Harry stepped backwards and trod on this armadillo and broke it. So my producer had to go back to the prop house and say, sorry, you've broken your armadillo. And they went completely apeshit. They were furious. This is a priceless armadillo. It's the only armadillo in the world. We're going to have to charge you £10,000 for this. Making a big song and dance, of course. Anyway, a year later, my producer Caroline went back to the prop house and they've got the armadillo in a glass case in the foyer with a sign underneath it saying trodden on by Harry Enfield.
Well, they'd made the most of it.
It's their proudest
They'd made the
boast.
most of a bad situation. Yeah. You just mentioned the fact that you hit a wall. Everything sounds so glittering. But I think I'm right in saying that in your 40s, you then had this moment where you suffered from depression. Well, had a period of time when you suffered from depression.
Yeah.
Could you set the scene in terms of career and relationships and what led to it?
Well, I was, as you've gathered, unfairly disposed of. I've never really been fired in the sense of I've broken a law or stolen something. I've been disposed of because I'm considered not any more necessary. But it'd be better if we had all the money and you didn't have any of it, that sort of area. Or just people trying to get out, not wanting to be told what to do, any number of reasons. So that happened a couple of times very unfairly, and I felt very betrayed. That's what triggered it, really. But I hope I'm a bit more grown up than I was all those years ago, because now I think what I should have done is, that's your loss. You must be a bit of an idiot if you think you'll be better without me, because it clearly won't be. And nor was it in these 2 cases. But I decided instead to be full of self-pity and resentment for nearly 10 years, which is now, I think of it, completely pathetic and quite unnecessary. If one was a grown-up and say, well, you must be nuts, mate, and I don't want to work with you anyway, because if you're going to be that selfish and greedy.
But it's hard to program yourself to think that way if you're feeling betrayed.
Well, yeah, because we are slaves to our own feelings. And the first 3 years were terrible because I was just angry and resentful. I started drinking much too much and smoking a lot, and just basically, we had small children, so I couldn't exactly run away, but I wasn't very well behaved after they'd gone to bed. But it took me looking at the pattern of my life, all these people who'd fired me, and I was very full of hurt. It then occurred to me, this is odd because I'm the common factor here. Why would people want to do this all the time? And then I also thought, first of all, I don't know anything. I've been coasting all this time. I've won all these prizes and scholarships. I don't know anything. I'd never been on a directing course. I don't know how to speak to an actor. Nobody's told me. I'm winging everything. I don't know anything. I don't know what depth of field is.
Been incredibly successful
but
doing it all.
It meant nothing. I used to have all the awards, all the certificates on my wall. I literally, walls of awards. I mean, dozens and dozens of prizes. And I looked at these things and I thought, is this what my life is? It's 60 pieces of cardboard framed behind glass. Is that what we're here for? So I just was very lost. And particularly, I was also angry because we had everything. You get very well paid if you're any good as a commercials director. We had 2 kids. We had a cottage in the country and a flat in London, a couple of cars. And all these prizes. And I think, what am I unhappy about? I've got everything. And of course, it was awful at the time, and I was very unhappy. But now I look back on it, it's a gift. Disaster is a gift, as I say. And you might find this a bit, perhaps we're going down a rabbit hole a bit. But the thing about philosophy is it doesn't have to be correct. It has to help you to live a better life, okay? Please don't write in, listeners, saying that's obviously not true, because it's not whether it's true or not, it's whether it works for you. So, and I choose to think that for reasons we're not quite sure about, the universe is a teaching machine. And if you're paying attention, everything in life can teach you something about yourself and how to live a more optimal life, have a nicer time, really. Because I couldn't understand how I'd been so successful up to this point where literally the portcullis had come down and suddenly I didn't win a single prize of any kind for at least 10 years, probably more. I was working just as hard. I was just as able at what I did. And then I started thinking all the time I was successful, all the times that I won things I probably didn't deserve to win them. That's a bit ridiculous too. And now I'm not winning them when I do deserve to win them sometimes. And again, bear with me, but I choose to think that the first part of my life, up until I was 42, the universe is saying, we want you to learn the virtues of diligence, of determination, of hard work, of not giving up when things get difficult. You've learned these, mate. And you don't need another prize to prove it. You don't need another person's opinion to tell you you're quite good at this stuff. We now require you, if you're willing to go along with us, to learn the virtues of humility, of listening to the other person's point of view, of kindness, of gentleness, of maybe thinking that sometimes it's your fault, not everybody else's fault, that kind of stuff, which obviously has consumed me considerably in the last 30 years. The way we're brought up in a Western mixed economy capitalist country is basically like your lovely house. We want the things. We want the Aston Martin and the nice kitchen, and we want our children to be successful and so that they can buy a house. And that we have this bizarre idea that making a lot of money and being famous or winning prizes is going to make us happy, and that isn't the case. I mean, it staves off temporarily. And I know people who've never made money said, just give me a chance to be that unhappy.
There was a Spike Milligan, which I read in your book.
Yeah.
And I'll test that theory.
I'm not saying it's not nice to have great skiing holidays or to own a chalet, or obviously it's good to have enough money and to be able to eat nice things. But there's a point at which that it is not delivering. I think most people say that if you earn a little bit more than your father, you're happy. Less than your father, you're not happy. If you earn 10 times my father, money and success doesn't deliver proportionally to the amount of it. So people who work for Goldman Sachs and have a bonus of 120 million a year do not get 120 million times happier. They get a teeny weeny kick out of the fact the other guy's only getting 115 million. And I was with an Uber driver the other day. I said, what do you do before you drove an Uber? He said I was a bodyguard for high net worth individuals, worked all over the world, super yachts, amazing places. I said, were they happy? He said, no. A lot of them were extremely unhappy, but nobody was happy. So the things that make me happy, friendship, a great conversation, my family, being engaged, being interested in things, that's stuff that never fails to live. It's not like a drug. These things, fame, money, power, success, they're just a different kind of drug. And the more you have, the more you crave.
Yeah, that's fantastic advice. And you figured this out on your own. So you got yourself out of the hole.
Yeah, because, again, naval kid, I just hear my father, don't be such a wet, John, pull yourself together, that sort of thing. You can hear him all the time. So the idea of going to a shrink or a therapist, it was very difficult to admit there was anything to do with me. It's just I thought it was very, very unfair. After about 3 years, I thought, I think I'm the problem here. I'm the armadillo that's broken, as it were. I need to fix me. And how do I do that? Well, first of all, I need to understand how things work. I don't know what an atom is or what the difference in that and a molecule is. And I don't have any scientific grounding at all. And I don't know what I'm doing. I don't know what happens when people die. Is that a thing? Where do thoughts come from? All these things. It's a really interesting thing because I started thinking, I mentioned earlier, when I was 15, I went to the Special Sixth, where we were encouraged to think for ourselves. And of course, at 15 is the perfect time because all 15-year-olds question everything. So I really did that. I started thinking for myself for the first time since I was 15, aged about 45. And it's very dark. I went to some very dark places. It's scary. I was willing to try more or less anything except go and see a psychiatrist because I didn't think I was mad. I thought everyone else appeared to be crazy. And yeah, piece by piece, you get, if you're lucky and you care, I think I've got a pretty good working idea of what the point of life is. And I reckon if you're really interested, you can find that out in a few years. Doing something about it is a whole other can of worms. Because once you know, this is the way to behave if you want to be happy, it's very difficult. Because the little monkey in your head is moving all the levers and making you go back on your word and not behave the way you know you should behave.
Well, I have to say, what you've just said to me is really helpful to me, reminding me about what's important as well. So actually, I'm going to take on board what you just said, because, yeah, that is so much more important than all the silly things that I can spend all my days worrying about. And it's very simple, really, when you boil it back to what's really important.
But also the nice things, they're also important. But the awful thing is, if you're lucky enough to have done okay in life and you have enough money to have nice things, you forget to be grateful. You forget to go, whoa, I'm alive. My fingers still work.
Yeah,
I'm
still
healthy.
In the game.
Yes. And this is also a treat, to have nice furniture and so forth. It's just we forget because we're so consumed by whatever it is that's eating us up.
You had an experience with your son when he was in a terrible accident, wasn't he?
Yeah.
That's Harry.
Yeah.
Who is a fantastic singer-songwriter. We saw him at a Money Maze podcast evening, and that's obviously my husband Simon and Will Campion, who is our mutual friend, and it's thanks to him that we're talking today. Yeah. But Harry is waiting for Smith as his stage name, and he has the most amazing music and fabulous voice. But the thing that I actually really took away from that evening, which I said to you earlier, was his wonderful interaction with the audience. And he had got us all singing and clapping and cheering. And he made the evening not only by his music, but just by the way that he was. But you had a big scare with him, didn't you?
Yeah, he was a French ski instructor. And one perfect day, he was doing avalanche training. It was the last exam, because the way the French ski school works is that you're what they call a stagiaire, so that you get to work, but when you start, you only earn 10% of what the ski school earns on your behalf. And at the end, when you've gone through all the stages, the stagiaire thing, you earn 90% of what the ski school charges. So he was on his very last exam, so it would have been a job for life. He was a very fine instructor. And they're up on the top of the mountain, and perfect blue sky, deep powder, hit something under the snow and double ejected from his skis, somersaulted and landed on his neck, broke 2 vertebrae. Was in the chopper on the way to hospital because obviously incredible pain. They gave him a morphine shot and nearly killed him because nobody knew he had a morphine allergy, which is
my
fatal.
Goodness. Did you know that?
So no, of course. How would you know?
No, of course you wouldn't know.
And his friend Fred, who's a fellow ski instructor, who is still an instructor, when they got to the same hospital that Michael Schumacher's still in, Grenoble, and Fred said to the young Russian doctor, he said, I think my friend's got a morphine allergy. And the doctor said, don't be ridiculous. I never heard of such a thing. He'd never heard of it. So they gave him another shot, and that's nearly dispatched him for the second time because his heart starts constricting. And on the operating table, he was apparently technically dead for 5 minutes. His heart stopped. And then all sorts of terrible disasters happened in the hospital afterwards because they see so many of these. It's tough love. They make you get up as soon as you're conscious. They make you get up again and walk about. It's awful. And then they gave him the wrong meds one night. He had no meds for a whole night. And I was on the phone to him most of the night as he's saying, I can't take it, Dad. I'm going to jump out of the window. He was on the 17th floor. He's going to throw a chair through the window and jump out because the pain was so excruciating.
Oh, my goodness.
So anyway, he's still here and he can walk and all that stuff. So
just gradually from that awful pain, things just got better.
It was a strange year because then my wife got something wrong with her back and had to have an operation. So there were 2 of them in bed for months with me. I laid out all the meds on the table, these pills for Harry at 4 and then these at 5 for Sarah and then this liquid. So it was quite an odd year. And a lovely bloke called Darren come round and taught Harry the guitar. So he'd lay in bed most of the day learning the guitar. So again, something really interesting's come out of it. And Harry always speaks very movingly about it, because when he was in the helicopter on the way to the hospital, literally fighting for his life and fighting for breath, he said to himself, if I get out of this alive, if I get another chance, I'm going to dedicate my life to music, because basically it's been great fun being an instructor. But he said, I don't want to be doing this when I'm 50. It's been a great thing, but now I need to do music. So that's what he's done. It's nearly 10 years now. It'll be 10 years.
And how's it going?
Really well. He's just got married last week.
Oh my goodness, I didn't realize, because he seems too young to be married, but that's because I'm quite old. So.
You look too young to be married, Katie. Shut up. No, he's doing a lot of touring at the moment. He's doing lots of co-writing. He's in a very good place at the moment.
Great. He deserves to do so well. He's a talented young man. We've covered so many things, John, and you've even talked to me about the meaning of life. And I want to finish then on the meaning of life, which was another book of yours. It's a dictionary of things where there should be words for. It's absolutely hilarious. That is absolutely the book you can buy for Christmas for anybody, even your 94-year-old granny. I'm going to just come up with two of them. Bethel, which is to pretend to have read the book under discussion when in fact you've only seen the TV series, which I have to say I have been known to do that myself. And then Gallipoli, the adjective, of the behaviour of a bottom lip trying to spit out mouthwash after an injection at the dentist, hence loose, floppy, useless.
Gallipoli. He's gone all Gallipoli on me. That's good. Since it's a Christmas present, the meaning of live, there's a good one in there, which is fulking. Fulking is pretending not to be in when the carol singers come round.
Yeah, it's brilliant. Okay, so how did you come up with that book?
Well, again, it's the pattern of my life. So Douglas Adams sacked me from Hitchhiker after I'd helped him finish the series, but we'd already booked a holiday to write the book together in Corfu. And so we both had no money, and so I went anyway. Douglas hated writing, and when I was writing with him, it was much easier for him. He had a much nicer time when we were writing together than he did on his own. But then that was his loss. So again, rather than sulking about it, I should have just said, fine, okay. But I was quite sulky about it. So I went on holiday anyway. We had lots of friends come to stay. And Douglas basically found it so difficult that by 11 o'clock in the morning, he was exhausted trying to write a novel which he'd never done before. So he'd come down to Verna on the beach and we play games. And one of the games we played was see how many random things you can remember in a list. Most people think they can remember 10 easily. They can't. 6 is most people's average. 7 is quite unusual. People who can remember 10 random objects are apparently genius, unless you know the trick. And Douglas and I worked out what the trick was. And so we could remember up to 250 random things in a string.
Wow. What's the trick?
I'll tell you afterwards.
Okay.
I'm not going to tell the public.
No, okay.
It's a really good trick. And the other one was a game that Douglas's English master used to play at school, which is when they had a free period, or in the summer when there wasn't much to do, is what do you think an Epping might be, or what's a Kettering? And we really enjoyed doing it. We'd play it with all our friends, because I hate to throw everything away. I wrote all these down, and I thought they were very, very funny. And
they are really funny.
And then we did the second Not the 9 O'Clock News book. We did a joke a day calendar, which is a Dutch format the publishers suggested. And it was like 365 jokes on the front of the page and more than 800 jokes. It was a lot. We ran out of jokes. And I thought, I remembered that thing, and I found this box of those funny definitions. So I put them in, and the publisher, Matthew Evans at Faber, said, this is a very funny book, John, but there's one really standout idea, and it was these little dictionary definitions of words there should be things for but aren't, and they're all place names.
It's brilliant. Thank you so much for going over the meaning of life and the meaning of life and taking us through your life. And thank you also for all the laughter that you have given so many of us over the years. And thank you so much for being here today. I've just loved it. It's been so brilliant.
I've really loved it too, Kate. It's been really interesting, informative, and you've made me think about my life in a way I sort of haven't before. It's odd, isn't it?
It's
been really nice.
Well, it's been absolutely fantastic for me. So thank you. You've been listening to Bandwidth Conversations. Thanks to Anna B., Head of Marketing, to all at the podcast consultant, to Bagawire for the music, to the Money Maze podcast. Thank you for listening. Any feedback, please email me, katie@bandwidthconversations.com. Please sign up on our website, www.bandwidthconversations.com, so we can notify you about new podcast releases. We hope to see you again soon.